Chapter 7. Dangerous Times. It was about 2 miles from Crampton to Marlborough Street. Margaret, who was absorbed in her own thoughts, did not notice anything unusual for the first mile and a half of her journey. But then she realized that there were even more people than usual on the crowded roads, and that they were not moving forward, but were talking excitedly. It was only when she arrived in Marlborough Street that she realized that there was an atmosphere of real anger in the crowd, and that in the distance the low roar of hundreds of voices could be heard. Margaret noticed all this, but did not understand its meaning. There was only one thought in her mind. Her mother was going to die. When she arrived at the house, the man who guarded the wall's tall wooden gates would only open them a little way. But when he recognized her, he let her in and quickly locked the gates behind her. Margaret walked up to the door of the house and was shown into the sitting room. Unusually, there was no sound of machinery from the factory, but the shouts of the crowds were growing louder. Fanny entered and said, "Mother will be here soon. My brother has brought in workers from Ireland, and the Milton people are very angry. For their own safety, the Irish workers are in the top room of the mill." Mrs. Thornton came in, looking thunderous, and Margaret realized she had arrived at a bad time. Nevertheless, she explained her mother's situation and made her request. Mrs. Thornton, who was listening to the shouts of the crowd outside, did not reply. Then she jumped up and exclaimed, "They're at the gates! Call John, Fanny! They'll break the gates down!" The women and the servants ran to the windows to look out. The wooden gates were shaking as men threw themselves against them. Fanny screamed, while Mrs. Thornton's face was white with fear. Mr. Thornton appeared. His face was a little red, but he did not look at all frightened. "You have come at an unfortunate moment, Miss Hale," he said. "Mother, you and the servants will be safer upstairs." The servants ran upstairs, but Mrs. Thornton said, "I will stay with you, of course. When will the soldiers arrive?" "In about 20 minutes," said her son calmly. 20 minutes? cried Mrs. Thornton, looking very frightened. Mr. Thornton went to the windows to close them, and as he did so they heard the sound of the gates breaking open. Fanny fainted, and her mother ran to her and carried her upstairs. "Should you not go upstairs too, Miss Hale?" said Mr. Thornton. "No," said Margaret. But now the workers had arrived at the house and were shouting so loudly that he could not hear her. "Let them shout," said Mr. Thornton coolly. "The soldiers will be here soon. Be brave, Miss Hale." "Don't be afraid for me. But please don't let the soldiers cut down those poor men," said Margaret passionately. "They are human beings. Go out and speak to them, man to man." A dark cloud came over Mr. Thornton's face when she said this, and he was silent. Then, "I will go," he said. He left the room. Margaret ran to the window and soon saw that he was standing on the steps to the house with his arms folded. As she watched, she saw some of the younger men in the crowd take off their shoes to throw at him. She ran downstairs and opened the door. Placing herself in front of Mr. Thornton, she cried, "Do not use violence! The soldiers are coming! Go before it is too late!" Mr. Thornton moved to one side so that he could be seen.
"Send the Irish workers away!"
shouted an angry voice.
"No!"
exclaimed Mr. Thornton, and the crowd started shouting insults. Margaret saw that the group of younger men were aiming their shoes at him. Desperately trying to save him, she stood in front of him and threw her arms around him. "Go away!" he said, and shook her off. At that moment a shoe almost hit them. A second later a stone hit Margaret hard on the forehead, and she fell onto Mr. Thornton's shoulder. He put his arms around her. "How brave you are!" he said scornfully to the crowds. "Hundreds of you attacking one woman!" The crowd went silent. Then, slowly, people started moving towards the gates. Only one voice cried, "The stone was meant for you, but you were hiding behind a woman!" Shaking with anger, Mr. Thornton placed Margaret gently on the steps and walked right into the middle of the crowd. "Kill me, if that is what you want," he said. But the crowd continued moving towards the gates. When he was sure they would not turn back, Mr. Thornton ran back up the steps to Margaret. "I'm all right," she said, and fainted. He picked her up and carried her, still unconscious, into the dining room. There he laid her on the sofa and cried passionately, "Oh, Margaret, no one knows what you mean to me. You are the only woman I have ever loved." His mother appeared. Fortunately, she did not seem to have heard his words. He told her what had happened and asked her to look after Margaret while he went to talk to the Irish workers. A servant called Jane came and started to bathe Margaret's face. Margaret opened her eyes, but after some moments closed them again. "We must fetch a doctor," said Mrs. Thornton, but she could not persuade either Fanny or the servants to go. Finally she said angrily, "I will go myself," and left the room. Jane, who had seen everything from an upstairs window, told Fanny what had happened. "She had her arms round Mr. Thornton's neck," said Jane. "I don't believe it," said Fanny. "I know she cares for my brother, anyone can see that, and I'm sure she would love it if he married her, which he never will. But I don't believe she would actually throw her arms around him." "Well, she did," replied Jane. As she spoke, Margaret's eyes opened and tears started pouring down her face. Mrs. Thornton came in, accompanied by a doctor. "How is she? Are you better, my dear?" she asked. Margaret gazed dreamily at her. The doctor examined her and then put a small bandage on her forehead. She sat up slowly and said, "I am better now. I must go home. The bandage is under my hair, so Mother will not see it." "You are not well enough to go home," said Mrs. Thornton. "I must," said Margaret. "May I ask for a carriage, please?" They could not persuade her to stay, and as the doctor did not think that her injuries were serious, it was agreed that she could go, but that the doctor would accompany her home. 5 minutes after Margaret left, Mr. Thornton came in. "Where is Miss Hale?" he asked anxiously. "Gone home," said his mother. "She was a lot better." "She could not have been well enough." She said she was, and the doctor said she was. She went home in a carriage. Let us talk of something else. She has caused enough disturbance. I don't know what would have happened to me without her. Do you really need a girl to defend you? Asked Mrs. Thornton scornfully. His face turned red. Not many girls would have done what she did. A girl in love will do almost anything, replied his mother, watching him carefully.
Mother.
He stepped forward, breathing heavily. Feeling uncomfortable, Mrs. Thornton changed the subject. You don't think there will be any more violence, do you? The soldiers will make sure there isn't. I'm going to arrange to have a guard around the house and mill. He left to do this and returned some hours later, explaining that he had arranged for the leaders of the strike to be arrested. Then he said, Mother, I am going to Crampton tomorrow to see Miss Hale. The servant who is taking the waterbed can ask how she is. I want to thank her myself for what she did, but there is another reason why I am going. Mrs. Thornton knew immediately what he was going to say. You feel that because she allowed her feelings about you to overcome her, that you must ask her to marry you. I dare not hope she will accept. I cannot believe such a creature cares for me. Don't be foolish, John. You talk as if she were a princess. She has shown her real feelings at last. I admit I like her more now. Dearest mother, I feel sure she does not care for me, but I have to ask her. They wished each other good night, and she kissed him, then went upstairs to her bedroom. There she locked the door and burst into tears, unable to bear the idea of losing him. When Margaret returned home, her father and mother were talking in low voices together, looking very pale. Mrs. Thornton will send the waterbed, Mother, said Margaret, still feeling as if she might faint. Dear, how tired you look. Is it very hot outside? Yes, and the strikers are very noisy. She prepared the tea with trembling hands and was glad that her parents did not notice. It was only when she was alone in her bedroom that she was able to think about the day's events. She sat in her chair and put her hands round her knees. I, who despise people who lack self-control, threw my arms around Mr. Thornton like a romantic fool. Did I do any good? The crowd would probably have gone away without me. This was her first judgment, but when she thought about it more coolly, she decided that her actions had probably helped the situation. But what made me defend him, as if he were a helpless child? I'm not surprised Fanny thought I was in love with him. Me, in love with Mr. Thornton. Her pale cheeks became bright red, and she started to cry. How terrible that they think that about me when I don't care about him at all. But it wasn't fair. One man against so many. I had to help him. I would do the same again if it was necessary. Having decided this, she lay down in her bed, too tired to move even one finger. She did not know if she slept that night. In her thoughts, her dreams, people were watching her and discussing her, and she was filled with shame. The next morning was a beautiful day, and Margaret decided that she would try to forget all about what had happened. She was doing some sewing in her room when Dixon came to tell her that Mr. Thornton had called and wanted to see her. "I will come," said Margaret quietly, but it was some minutes before she found the courage to meet him. Mr. Thornton was standing by the sitting-room window, his heart beating fast. When he thought of the touch of Margaret's arms around his neck, he felt as if he were on fire. He was afraid he would lose all self-control, that he would hold out his arms to her and beg her to come into them. He feared that she would reject him, but he could not imagine a future without her. She came in, looking pale and tired, but very beautiful. Mr. Thornton went to the door and shut it. He said, "Miss Hale, I am so very grateful to you for—" "You had nothing to be grateful for," said Margaret quickly. "It was a natural reaction. Any woman would have done the same." "I disagree. I owe my life to you. Oh, Miss Hale, I owe everything to you. To the woman I love as I have never loved a woman before." He took her hand and held it tight, but she said icily, "The way you speak shocks me. You seem to think that what I did was because of my feelings for you. You are wrong. I would have done the same for any man in that crowd." "Am I not allowed to thank you or express my feelings?" said Mr. Thornton. "Not in the way you have done." "I understand now. It is clear you despise me. I think you do not understand me." "I do not wish to understand you." "No, I see that you do not." Despite his angry words, all Mr. Thornton wanted to do was to throw himself at Margaret's feet. She started to cry. He waited, hoping for a reply, but when she remained silent, he picked up his hat to leave. "You seem insulted by my feelings, but I cannot help it. Until now, I have never loved any woman. I have been too busy. You cannot stop me from loving you, but do not be afraid that I will annoy you by talking about my feelings." "I am not afraid," said Margaret, standing very straight. "But, Mr. Thornton, you have been very kind to my father. Please, let us not be angry with each other. Please." Her whole manner softened when she said these words, but Mr. Thornton did not answer. He refused the hand that she held out, then turned and left the room. Margaret thought she saw tears in his eyes, and she felt sorry that she had hurt him. "But how could I help it?" she asked herself. "I never liked him. I was polite, but nothing more. This is his fault, not mine." When Mr. Thornton left the house that morning, he had a violent headache and wanted to sit down and cry like a little child. A bus stopped, and without thinking he got onto it. It took him to a small country town. He went into the fields and walked aimlessly, recalling everything Margaret had said and done that morning. Then he thought about every time he had met her and the way she had looked and acted. He became more and more certain that there never was and never would be anyone like her. He knew that she did not love him and never would, but he also knew that nothing could stop him from loving her. He returned to the mill late in the afternoon and spent the rest of the day working. Due to the events of the previous day, he had many arrangements to make. It was dark when he returned home, but his mother was waiting for him. She did not want to appear anxious, and when she heard him at the door, she pretended to be absorbed in a book. He came in, and at first she did not look up. Then she said, "Well, John?" He kissed her on the forehead and said in a low voice, "No one loves me, no one cares for me, except you, Mother." Tears came to his eyes, and he turned away and leant against the wall. She stood up and almost fell. Then, putting her hands on his shoulders, she looked into his eyes and said, "A mother's love is forever. A girl's love changes with every wind. She would not have you, would she, John?" "I am not good enough for her, Mother. I knew I was not, but I love her more than ever."
"And I hate her for what she has done to you,"
said Mrs. Thornton fiercely. "That is unfair. But let us never talk about her again."
"With all my heart."
Chapter 8. A Time of Change. Margaret was so surprised by Mr. Thornton's declaration of love that she remained standing in the middle of the sitting-room for some time after he had gone. She could not help comparing Mr. Thornton with Mr. Lennox and thinking how different they were. Henry Lennox seemed to have slipped over the boundary between friendship and love for a moment, and to have regretted it almost immediately. With Mr. Thornton, on the other hand, there had been no friendship. They had done nothing except argue with one another. And now he had come in this strange, wild way to tell her that he loved her and would always love her. Margaret was horrified by this declaration, but she could not stop thinking about him, and the look in his deep, strangely passionate eyes. Not wanting to be alone, she went upstairs to see her mother, who was resting in her room. Mrs. Hale spent 5 minutes praising the waterbed, which she said was very comfortable, and then turned the conversation to the subject closest to her heart. "Margaret," she said, sitting up very straight on her sofa, "if I am going to die soon, I must see Frederick first. I beg you to bring him to me. If he came for 5 minutes only, it would not be dangerous. Oh, let me see him before I die." Margaret felt that her mother's desire to see Frederick was so natural that she should do everything she could to bring him to her, even though it might be dangerous for Frederick. "I will write to him tonight. I am sure he will come." "You must write this afternoon. The post goes at 5. I have so little time left. If we miss one post, it may be too late." "But I need to talk to Father, and he is out." "Do you think he will deny my last wish? I would not be dying if he had not brought me to this smoky, sunless place." "Oh, Mother," said Margaret sadly. "It is true. He has said so himself. He would do anything for me. Don't lose time, dear Margaret. Write now." Margaret sat down to write the letter. She took it to the post office and was walking back home when she met her father. When he heard what she had done, he looked very worried.
You should have waited until I came, Margaret, he said.
I tried to persuade her.
I don't know. If she wants to see him so much, then Frederick must come. It would do her more good than any medicine. But the danger to Frederick is very great, I'm afraid.
It is a long time since the mutiny, Father.
When a man has been involved in a mutiny, the government never forgets. They will do anything to find him.
Oh, what have I done? But it seemed so right at the time.
No, I am glad you sent the letter, Mr. Hale said, trying to sound cheerful, but Margaret could see from his face that he was very anxious. They walked home without saying another word. The next day, Mr. Thornton, who was a magistrate, had a meeting with the other Milton magistrates about the riot at his mill 2 days earlier. Many of these men were older and wealthier than he was, but they listened to his opinions with great respect. When he left the meeting, Mr. Thornton's mind was clear. But within minutes he began to think about Margaret and to remember the feeling of her arms around him. He was walking back to the mill when he met Dr. Donaldson, who told him the sad news about Mrs. Hale. Mr. Thornton asked if he could do anything to help, and when he was told that Mrs. Hale often asked for fruit, he went immediately to the best shop in Milton and chose the finest fruit there. It was placed in a basket, and he carried it himself, walking fast, to the Hales' house. The family were in the sitting-room, and he entered, his eyes shining with kindness, and presented the fruit to Mrs. Hale. Margaret, who was sewing, was afraid of making any movement that would make him aware of her presence. "I'm afraid I cannot stay," Mr. Thornton said. "But you must allow me the pleasure of bringing some fruit again. Good afternoon, Mr. Hale. Goodbye, madam." He was gone. Not one word, one glance at Margaret. She thought that he had not seen her. "How kind of him to think of me," said Mrs. Hale. "Do you not think so, Margaret?"
Yes,
said Margaret quietly. After a few minutes she left the room and met Dixon, who handed her a note. "That young woman you go to see, Higgins, I mean, she died this morning. Her sister is here and wants to speak to you."
"Oh, poor Bessie,"
said Margaret, bursting into tears, and she went down to the kitchen to see Mary. The girl, who had been crying so much that her face was swollen, explained that that morning, about an hour after Nicholas had gone out, Bessie had suddenly become very ill. Some neighbours had run to Mary's workplace to find her, but they had been unable to find her father. Mary had arrived only a few minutes before Bessie died.
"She loved you so much. Please come and see her, madam. She would have wanted you to."
"Yes, I will. I'll come this afternoon." That afternoon, Margaret walked quickly to the Higgins. Mary opened the door to her, and they went upstairs to the room where Bessie lay. Her face, which had often looked so exhausted from pain, now had a soft smile, and although there were tears in Margaret's eyes, deep inside she felt very calm. So this was death. It looked more peaceful than life. Slowly she turned away from the bed, and she and Mary went downstairs without a word.
Nicholas Higgins was standing in the middle of the room. He had only just learnt the news, and his eyes were huge and dry and fierce. Margaret tried to creep past him, to leave him with his daughter, but he seized her arm and cried, "Did you see her die?" "No," answered Margaret, standing still. "You're sure she's dead?" "She is dead." He looked at her searchingly, then suddenly threw himself halfway across the table and began to sob. "Get out of here!" he cried to Margaret. She took his hand and held it in hers. It was a long time before he was able to calm down, but then he asked her to come with him to Bessie's room, and she did so. "Nothing can hurt her now," he said, as he stood by his daughter's bed. He looked so pale and ill that Margaret had the idea of suggesting that he should talk to her father. Higgins desperately needed comfort, and, knowing that Mr. Hale had been a clergyman, agreed to visit him. Some neighbours came in to look after Mary, and the two walked in silence to Crampton. Margaret quickly explained the situation to Mr. Hale, and then led Higgins into the study. She went upstairs to see her mother, and it was some time before she came down again. She was surprised to see the two men with their heads close together, apparently having a serious conversation. They looked up when Margaret came in, and Higgins said proudly, "We've been discussing religion, and now we're talking about the strike." "I wish some of the mill owners would meet some of you men and have a good talk about things," said Mr. Hale. "I am sure it would be the best way of overcoming your difficulties. I wonder if Mr. Thornton could be persuaded to do so." "Thornton? He's the fellow who brought over the Irish workers. Then the leaders of the riot ruined it for everyone. Violence isn't the way. But now, when people would have thanked him for taking the riot leaders to court, Mr. Thornton has decided not to do it. He says they won't be able to find work again, and that's enough punishment." "Has the strike ended, then?" asked Margaret. "Yes," said Nicholas angrily. "The mill doors will open again tomorrow." "Will you get your old job back?" "No chance. Hamper, my mill owner, thinks I'm a troublemaker. He'd rather cut his leg off than give my job back to me." Margaret thought for a moment, and then said hesitantly, "Why don't you go to Marlborough Mill and ask Mr. Thornton?" Nicholas shook his head in disbelief. "Mr. Thornton? He won't see me." "I will write a note for you to give him," said Mr. Hale, eager to help. "It's kind of you, but I'll do it by myself or not at all. I'll go because you ask me, Miss Margaret. I'll wait for him tomorrow until he comes out of the mill. I'll tell him about the Boucher family and their troubles, and that I want to help them. But the clock is striking 10. I must go." He rose, looked steadily at Margaret and Mr. Hale, brushed his hand across his eyes, and left the room. "How proud that man is," said Mr. Hale, a little annoyed that Higgins had refused his offer of help. "Yes, but how strong and honest he is too," said Margaret. The next morning a letter arrived from Edith. It was full of affection, like its writer, and described Edith's little boy, who had been born a few weeks earlier. Edith was very insistent that Margaret and her mother should come and stay with her in Corfu for at least 3 months. She did not ask Mr. Hale, whom she blamed for taking the family away from Helston. Margaret would have loved to go to Corfu and live Edith's life, just for one day. She was not yet 20, but she felt so old, and she thought that it might make her feel young again. Her mother came in, and they were laughing about Edith's letter when Mr. Thornton appeared, with another basket of fruit for Mrs. Hale. He had come because of his great need to see Margaret again. But after he had glanced in her direction, he bowed coldly to her and turned away. He presented the fruit to Mrs. Hale and talked kindly to her for a few minutes. He did not look at Margaret, and when she spoke seemed not to hear her, although his next remark showed that he had. His behaviour was not polite at all, but it was clear to Margaret that the reason why he was behaving badly was because he was very hurt. He left with one last cold, offended look at her, unaware that his behaviour was making Margaret think about him more than ever before. She regretted hurting him so deeply, and would have been very happy to return to their previous relationship. She now realised that they had in fact been friends. Mr. Thornton, as he walked downstairs, was proud of the way he had forced himself to see her and not reveal his feelings. He thought that he hated seeing the woman who had treated him so cruelly the previous day. But he was very wrong. Chapter 9. Mrs. Hale. Mrs. Thornton came to see Mrs. Hale the next morning. Mrs. Hale was much worse. A sudden change had taken place during the night, and now, with her grey face and hollow cheeks, she looked as if death could not be far away. Mrs. Thornton had not believed that Mrs. Hale was really ill, and she had only come because her son had insisted. But now that the reality of the younger woman's death was clear, she softened immediately. Mrs. Hale lay still, then with a great effort reached for her visitor's hand and whispered, "My child will be without a mother in a strange place. If I die, will you... You wish me to be your daughter's friend?" Mrs. Hale could not speak, but she pressed her visitor's hand. Mrs. Thornton sighed. It was difficult to say that she would be kind to Margaret, whom she disliked so much. "I am not the kind of person who shows affection, but I will be a true friend to Miss Hale. If she is in difficulty and comes to me for help, I will do everything I can for her. I also promise that if I ever see her doing something that I think is wrong, I will tell her, just as if she were my own daughter." There was a long pause. Mrs. Hale felt that this promise did not include everything, and she did not really understand why. But perhaps this was because she was very ill. "I thank you," she said. "I shall never see you again in this world, but I thank you for your promise of kindness to my child." "Not kindness," said Mrs. Thornton. But fortunately Mrs. Hale did not hear her. Mrs. Thornton held the dying woman's hand for a moment and left the house without seeing anyone. Meanwhile, Margaret and Dixon were discussing how to keep Frederick's visit a secret from anyone except the family. A letter was expected any day, and he would certainly arrive soon afterwards. They decided that if Dixon needed help in the kitchen, they would ask Mary Higgins. They knew that if she met Frederick, who would be known as Mr. Dickinson, she would not be interested in finding out more about him. Poor Margaret! All that day she had to ignore her own feelings and look after her father, who sat in the sitting room with his head in his arms. From time to time Mrs. Hale suffered terrible pain, but in the evening she slept, and Dixon sat with her. Darkness came. Margaret did not want to leave her father, and the lamps had not been lit. She was sitting at the window looking out at the street when suddenly the doorbell rang. She jumped up and went down to open the door. A tall man was standing there, but she could not see his face. "Is this Mr. Hales?" he said clearly. Margaret trembled all over, then whispered, "Frederick," and held out her arms to him. They kissed each other. "Mother, is she alive?" "She is very, very ill, but she is alive." "Thank God. Did you receive my letter?" "No, but we knew you would come." Margaret took Frederick to Mr. Hale's study and lit a lamp. Now she could see that his face was quite brown from the sun and that his eyes were very blue and bright. They did not exchange a word, but there was an immediate understanding between them, and Margaret's heart was much lighter as she went upstairs. It took Mr. Hale some time to understand that Frederick had come, and when he did, he began to cry like a child. Leaning on Margaret's arm, he went down to the study, and Margaret left him with Frederick. She ran upstairs and cried bitterly. It was the first time she had allowed herself this relief for days. Frederick had come. He was safe. She could hardly believe it. Feeling much better, she went into the kitchen, made the fire, lit lamps, and prepared food for the traveller. She came into the study carrying the dishes like a servant, and Frederick immediately jumped up to take them from her. It was typical of his loving behaviour over the next few days. The brother and sister put some plates on the table, saying little, their hands touching, their eyes speaking to each other. They heard Dixon moving about in the kitchen, and Margaret went to tell her the news. Mrs. Hale was awake, but they decided that they would not tell her that Frederick had arrived until after Dr. Donaldson's visit in the morning. He would be able to tell them how to prepare her for seeing her son. Frederick and his father sat in the study talking, while Margaret said nothing but listened quietly. It was a huge source of strength to her that her brother had come. She examined his appearance carefully and liked it. He had delicate features and a friendly, cheerful expression that could change suddenly and become very passionate. She could see that he understood his father's character and his weaknesses. He knew exactly how to talk to him and make him feel better. Perhaps because she was older now, the brother and sister felt closer to each other than ever before. When Mrs. Hale saw Frederick the next morning, she seemed to improve. She sat with his hand in hers and would not let go of it even while she slept. "I am very selfish," she said, "but it will not be for long." Frederick bent down and kissed the hand that imprisoned his. Kind Dr. Donaldson told Margaret that her mother did not have many hours to live, but Frederick could not believe it. That night, however, Mrs. Hale became unconscious and died before morning. Frederick, who had been so strong until then, now sobbed so violently that Margaret and Dixon feared that their next-door neighbours would hear him. Margaret sat with her father in her mother's room. He did not speak, but from time to time stroked his wife's face, making a soft sound like an animal with her young. He ignored Margaret completely, and her heart ached for him so much that she could not think of her own loss at all. Morning came, and Margaret did her household duties, her eyes almost blinded with tears. Her father and brother were so full of grief that she felt she had to look after them. She made breakfast and lit a fire, but the contrast between its bright cheerfulness and her own thoughts made her kneel by the sofa and cry into the cushions. Dixon found her there and spoke gently to her, and the old servant's kindness made her feel a little better. At breakfast, Mr. Hale did not seem to know where he was, and Frederick burst into tears. Afterwards, when Margaret tried to discuss the arrangements for the funeral, Mr. Hale understood almost nothing, but asked Margaret to write to his friend Mr. Bell in Oxford and tell him the news. Towards evening, Dixon told Margaret that she did not feel it was safe for Frederick to stay in Milton. She explained that while she was shopping, she had met a young man called Leonards, whose family she had known in Southampton. He was a sailor and had been on the Russell at the same time as Frederick, although Dixon did not know if he had taken part in the mutiny. She had recognized Leonards, and they had had a short conversation. He had asked about Frederick and talked about the mutiny, saying that Frederick would be hanged if he was caught. He said that £100 reward had been offered for catching Frederick, and suggested that Dixon could help to trap him, and that they would then share the reward. Dixon had never liked or trusted Leonards. Her story made Margaret feel very uncomfortable. "Have you told Frederick?" she asked. "No, but I've told your father, and he thinks that Frederick must leave." The two women felt the same, but it was very hard for Margaret, just when Frederick had returned to his family. She was sitting by the fire and thinking about this when Frederick came in. "How tired you look, Margaret," he said. "You have been looking after everybody and no one has looked after you. Lie on the sofa. There is nothing for you to do." Margaret gladly went to lie down, and the two began to talk in low tones. Margaret told Frederick Dixon's story, and he looked shocked. "Leonards was the worst sailor on the ship, and a really nasty fellow. All the sailors who had the right ideas were angry with the captain, but Leonards was always trying to please him, and he's here, in Milton. If he knew I was here, he'd tell the police without a doubt." Mr. Hale heard what they were saying and came towards them, eager and trembling. He took Frederick's hands in his. "My boy, you must go. It is very bad, but you must. You have done all you could. You have been a comfort to your mother." "Perhaps I should stay and let them take me to court," said Frederick thoughtfully. "No, you must go." Frederick changed the subject. "Do you know, I was in my bedroom this afternoon and the doorbell rang, so I waited for some time until I thought the visitor had left. Then I opened the door and saw a great powerful fellow going down the stairs." "It was Mr. Thornton," said Mr. Hale. "Mr. Thornton?" said Margaret, a little surprised. I thought you meant someone of a different class, not a gentleman. He looked like someone who worked in a shop, said Frederick carelessly. But it seems he's a manufacturer. Margaret was silent, remembering how, before she knew Mr. Thornton well, she had thought of him in just the same way. She wanted to make Frederick understand what kind of person Mr. Thornton was, but she could not think what to say. Mr. Hale continued. He came to offer to help us, but I could not see him. I told Dixon to ask if he wished to see you, Margaret. Margaret was silent, and after some moments Frederick said, It is painful to think I can never thank those who have shown you kindness. But you could both come to Spain. I have a good job there and a promise of promotion. Margaret, I told you about Dolores Barber. She is not yet 18, but I hope that in a year she will be my wife. You would love her if you knew her, I am sure. If you came, you would have so many friends. No, no more changes for me, said Mr. Hale. Moving here has cost me my wife. I am staying here. Oh, Frederick, I am so glad you have someone to love and care for you out there, said Margaret. I know you took part in the mutiny, but for Dolores' sake, perhaps you should try and prove that the most serious accusations are not true. A discussion began. Frederick did not know if it was possible to find the witnesses, all of them sailors, who could explain why the mutiny had happened. I don't think the attempt would be successful, he said doubtfully. But could we not at least try to find them? There is a friend of mine, a lawyer, a very clever man, who would be happy to help you. Mr. Henry Lennox's father. Margaret blushed when she said this. I think it is a good idea, said Mr. Hale. But Frederick must not stay in England just to see him. Listen to my plan, said Margaret. Frederick, you could take the night train to London tomorrow and leave a note from me for Mr. Lennox at his home the following day. Then you could take the next boat from London. Mr. Hale and Frederick immediately agreed to the plan, and Frederick wrote down a list of sailors' names. Margaret wrote the note to Lennox with Frederick looking over her shoulder, and she did not have time to worry about whether she was using the right words after their last difficult meeting. The family sat together in the sitting room all the next day. Mr. Hale only spoke when his children asked him questions. Frederick was now ashamed that he had allowed his grief to overcome him, and although his sorrow was very real, he did not speak about it again. Margaret was suffering more now and spent a lot of the time crying. Mr. Hale and Margaret wanted to make sure that Frederick was safely on the night train to London, and they decided that Margaret would accompany him to Outwood Station. It was bitterly painful for Mr. Hale to say goodbye to his son, and Margaret hurried Frederick into the carriage that was taking them there. They arrived at the station quite early and went to walk in a field next to the station. They were talking about their father when a horse rider passed slowly by. The evening sun was shining directly on Margaret's face, and she bowed to the rider, who bowed stiffly back. "Who is that?" asked Frederick. "Mr. Thornton. You saw him before, you know," said Margaret, looking worried. By now it was time to return to the station, and Frederick went to buy his ticket. They were walking down the railway platform when they heard the sound of the approaching train. Just then a porter came up to them. It was clear that he was drunk, and he pushed Margaret to one side, then seized Frederick by his collar.
"Your name is Hale, I believe."
When Frederick heard this, he immediately pushed the man away, and the porter fell off the platform, a distance of 3 or 4 feet. "Run! Run!" whispered Margaret urgently. "The train is here!" It was Leonard's, wasn't it? A carriage door was open, and Frederick jumped into the train. As he leant out to say goodbye, the train started to leave, and Margaret was left standing alone. She felt so sick and faint that she went into the waiting room to sit down. When she felt a little better, she began to wonder if the man had been seriously hurt, and although she was frightened to do this, she went back to the platform to look for him. No one was there. She was trembling so much that she felt she could not walk home along the dark, lonely road, and she decided to take the next train back. But supposing Leonard's recognized her as Frederick's companion? Fortunately, when she went to get her ticket, there were only a few railway officials there, talking loudly to one another.
"So, Leonard has been drinking," said one of them. "He came in about 5 minutes ago with a story about how he'd fallen off the platform. He wanted to borrow some money to go to London by the next train. I refused, and he's gone off somewhere. To have another drink, I guess,"
said another man. Frightened that Leonard's would return, Margaret hid in the waiting room until the next train came. She was helped into the carriage by a porter whose face she did not dare to look at until the train started moving. Then she saw that it was not Leonard's.